Ghosts of London by E. Donnell. The Tower of London and Bethlehem Asylum. If tragedy be the most prolific source of ghosts, and my investigations have led me to believe that it is, surely no place should be more haunted than the Tower of London. For many years, more particularly in the Middle Ages, it was almost daily the scene of someone's unhappy death, for not only were executions, authorized by royal warrant, carried out there, but within its walls murders were secretly committed and accompanied, in most instances, by cruelties of a nature too ghastly and revolting to be told. That its weird and gloomy precincts have been haunted in the past there is little doubt. This opinion is not founded only on the theory of cause and effect, but on certain records, and should certain rumors recently circulated have any foundation in fact, it would seem that similar hauntings may be experienced there at the present time. Perhaps the best authenticated story of a tower ghost was that published in Notes and Queries for I-860 by Mr. Edmund Lenthal Swift, Keeper of the Crown Jewels from 1814 to 1852. According to this story, late one Saturday night in October 1817, Mr. and Mrs. Swift, their son, and Mrs. Swift's sister, were seated at supper in the sitting room of the Jewel House, which had recently been modernized. The doors, 3 in number, were all closed, the dark and heavy window curtains were drawn close, and the only light in the room came from 2 tall wax candles on the table. Mr. Swift sat at one end of the table, his son sat beside him on his right hand, Mrs. Swift faced the chimney piece, and her sister sat opposite her. Midnight had just struck, and Mrs. Swift was about to take a sip of wine, when she looked up and immediately cried out, "Good God! What is that?" Upon following his wife's gaze, Mr. Swift saw a cylindrical-shaped object like a glass tube, hovering, in mid-air, between the table and the ceiling. It was about the thickness of his arm and contained a thick fluid, part of which was white and part light blue. As he stared at it, the white and blue intermingled and then separated, and kept on doing so for about 2 minutes, during which time no one spoke. Then the thing began to move very slowly, passing directly in front of Mr. Swift's sister-in-law, his son and himself. On reaching Mrs. Swift, it paused for a moment, and then very slowly and deliberately stationed itself immediately above her right shoulder. The moment this happened, Mrs. Swift crouched down, and putting both hands on her right shoulder shrieked out, "Oh, Christ! It has seized me." Mad with anger and fright at the thing's attack on his wife, Mr. Swift picked up a chair, and swinging it round his head aimed a terrific blow at the cylindrical object. The chair, however, passed right through the thing, encountering no resistance till it struck the wall, and at the same time, apparently, or a few seconds later, upon this point Mr. Swift is not very clear, the cylindrical object vanished. What may seem strange to some people is that only Mr. and Mrs. Swift saw the cylindrical object, the 2 present besides, saw nothing. To those, however, who, like myself, have had experience with ghostly phenomena, there is nothing very extraordinary in this circumstance, since it not infrequently happens that while some of the people present in a room or elsewhere see a ghostly form, the rest of those present do not, the reason being, so I believe, that ghosts have the power of appearing exclusively to those to whom they wish to appear. In other words, they have the power of rendering themselves visible to some and invisible to others, at one and the same time. Skeptics declare that the phenomena Mr. and Mrs. Swift saw must have been due either to trickery or to some natural and physical agency, not necessarily in the room, but operating, maybe, from a distance, but Mr. Swift left no stone unturned to prove definitely that such could not have been the case. He was not a spiritualist, nor did he claim to be psychic, therefore he was in a position to examine what had happened with an open and unbiased mind, and after much deliberation and careful analysis he came to the conclusion that the phenomenon he and his wife had witnessed could not be satisfactorily explained in accordance with any known physical laws.
Please like and subscribe
This,
for our channel.
apparently, was the only ghostly phenomenon he himself had experienced during his long term of office at the Tower, but we have his authority for another strange occurrence that took place there. At about 12 o'clock one night in January 1816, A sentry pacing the paved yard in front of the jewel house saw a dark object coming up the flight of stone steps under the building. The steps being in semi-darkness, he could form no definite idea as to the identity of this object, which was not a human being, he thought, but some queer kind of animal. However, as he stared at it, with increasing wonder and alarm, a moonbeam falling directly on it proved it to be an enormous bear, that was rapidly advancing towards him, with a horrible glitter in its eyes. For a moment or so he was too powerless to stir, but on realizing that the creature, unless it were stopped, would soon have him in its clutches, he struck at it furiously with his bayonet. To his unmitigated horror, the bayonet passed right through the bear without encountering any hindrance and stuck in the wall beyond, whilst the bear, obviously unharmed, came on. This was the climax. With a wild shriek of terror, he fell to the ground in a fit. When, on the morrow, I saw the unfortunate sentinel in the main guard room, Mr. Swift writes, his fellow sentinel was with him and testified to having seen him at his post, just before the alarm, awake and alert, and to have spoken to him. Moreover, I then heard the man tell his own story. I saw him once again on the following day, but changed beyond recognition. In another day or two the brave and steady soldier, who could have mounted a breach and led a forlorn hope with unshaken nerves, died, the victim of a shadow. Surprise has been expressed that any man should die from the effect of having seen a ghost, but there is no reason for supposing this case to be unique. Those who are acquainted with ghost lore will know of cases of a more or less similar nature. When I asked the late Mr. W.T. Stead for the address of a certain badly haunted house in Barnet, he refused to give it to me, declaring that the ghost was dangerous, several people who had seen it having suffered so great a shock from the encounter that death had ensued. I admit this statement seemed to me at the time to be incredible, but I have no doubt now that Mr. Stead was right, for my own subsequent experiences with ghostly phenomena have forced me to the conclusion that a certain percentage of sudden deaths from heart failure are primarily due to some horrifying manifestation from the darker side of the unknown. Nor do such calamities always happen to people known to have led wicked and dissolute lives, they happen sometimes to the most exemplary. Very probably the phantom seen by the sentry in the tower was that of one of the bears that used to be kept there for the cruel purpose of baiting, for tragedy in the lives of animals has the same result psychically as it has in the lives of humans, a fact, I would add, which renders the frequency of animal ghosts not at all surprising. Another tower haunting is that of Anne Boleyn. Her phantom has not only been seen on the Tower Hill, it has appeared, at least on one occasion, in the Tower Chapel. According to an authentic account of her appearance in the Tower Chapel, it seems that, at midnight, a certain captain, who was on duty at the tower, set off on his rounds, with one of the sentries. When they came to the chapel, the captain was surprised to see that it was lighted up. "What's the meaning of that?" he remarked to the sentry. "Surely it's too late an hour for any service." "Yes, sir," the sentry responded. "There ain't no service, but I've often seen that light and stranger things too. So have the other night sentries, and I'm blessed if we can hexplain them. They beat us, they do." "It's certainly very odd," the captain said, and he stared, rubbed his eyes, and stared again. The light was still there, however, it was no hallucination. "Fetch a ladder," he said, and when the ladder arrived, he placed it against the chapel wall, and mounting it peered through one of the windows. What he saw thrilled him through and through. Nothing could have been more amazing. The whole interior of the chapel was illuminated with a bluish-white light, emanating seemingly from nowhere, and coming down the center aisle was a procession of stately men and women, clad in the court costume of Henry VIII's time. The men for the most part were extremely handsome, and the women strikingly beautiful, but at their head walked a lady more beautiful than any of them. Jewels sparkled in her hair and on her snow-white neck and arms, and the captain, who had but lately seen and admired a portrait of Anne Boleyn, instantly recognized in the leader of the procession that unhappy lady. They advanced in absolute silence, with heads held erect and eyes that looked neither to the right nor left, but always straight ahead of them. Presently the light, which, as I have said, seemed to emanate from nowhere, became concentrated on the leader of the procession, and the captain, who was very susceptible to the charms of the other sex, marveled at the beauty of her slim white fingers, which were conspicuously adorned with rings of the costliest description. On arriving at the bottom of the center aisle, the procession made a detour of the chapel by way of the side aisles, and after perambulating thus several times, it suddenly vanished, the light disappearing with it and leaving the interior of the building in utter darkness. It was then, and not until then, when he could no longer see the figures and marvel at their magnificence and beauty, that the captain first began to realize that the actors in the spectacle he had witnessed were not living human beings at all, but mere phantoms. He never saw the phenomenon again, though, doubtless, he often wished he might do so. The council chamber, one of the staterooms in the tower, where tradition affirms Guy Fawkes was examined and probably racked, is said to be haunted. I can find no authentic record of any ghost having been seen there, although there are plenty of rumors to that effect. When I visited the tower many years ago, for the first time, an official I closely questioned as to the alleged hauntings told me there was a story current concerning this particular room. It was to this effect. A soldier on duty at the tower, passing the council chamber at night, heard dreadful groans proceeding from it. Thinking someone must be ill, he was about to rap, when the door abruptly opened and a huge figure, well over 6 feet in height, came out. In build it was like a man, but its nude body was entirely covered with reddish-brown hair, which gave it the appearance of an ape. Its face, foliage was clean-shaven and pallid, might have been that of a middle-aged man, but the expression on it was hardly human and devilish to a degree. Without apparently noticing the soldier, who, realizing that what he saw was nothing belonging to this world, was, in consequence, petrified with horror, the thing walked along the passage, till it came to a flight of stairs, down which it vanished. The soldier thereupon regained his equanimity to some extent, but was thankful enough when his vigil for that night ended and he was able to rejoin his comrades. Unfortunately, the identity of this phantom cannot be satisfactorily established. But for the fact that the soldier who saw it was quite sure that it had the face of a man, one might have supposed it to have been the ghost of an ape whose bones had been discovered shortly before in an unoccupied turret of the tower. No other theory was formulated, and consequently its identity remains unproven. I cannot, of course, guarantee the truth of this story. I can only say it was told me with every appearance of sincerity. I admit that many of the noises heard in the tower at night and attributed to ghosts may well be caused by rats that come, in shoals, from the Thames, with the tide, but, obviously, rats must be ruled out in the case of things seen, and if the things seen can only be accounted for by the superphysical, why may not the things heard be so accounted for too? Another building, no less famous in its way than the tower, that at one time, at least, possessed a ghost, was the Hospital of the Star of Bethlehem, London's first lunatic asylum. We have all, I imagine, heard of Bedlam, and many of us, no doubt, have friends whom we think ought to be there, but it is not all of us who know that this very significant name owes its origin to the Hospital of the Star of Bethlehem, of which latter word Bedlam is a contraction. As far back as 1246, Simon Fitzmary, a London sheriff, founded a priory on the site of the present Liverpool Street Station. It is interesting to remember that where we now see railway trains and crowds of eager, hustling travelers, ascetic monks and pious nuns used once to tell their beads, sprinkle holy water and chant their prayers, which priory, some centuries later, was converted into the Hospital of the Star of Bethlehem for insane people. The method of dealing with maniacs in those days differed very much from that employed in our day, for then mad people were generally regarded as obsessed by evil spirits, and in order to get rid of the latter, when exorcism failed, recourse was had to the stick. Thus the poor unfortunate wretches who, through no fault of their own, were insane, were often subjected to the most severe chastisement, and even in more enlightened times, when such a superstition no longer existed, Lunatics frequently received very brutal treatment at the hands of their keepers. It follows, therefore, that tragedies in lunatic asylums in those days were not uncommon, and probably they were far more common than was ever dreamed of by the public, despite the fact that its suspicions must have been aroused by works such as Valentine Vox, which was a more or less successful attempt at exposure. Happily, however, this kind of cruelty in asylums has long since ceased, and we are only reminded of it by occasional rumors of ghostly happenings in certain of the older institutions. To return to the priory. It was given by Henry VIII to the City of London, who, after due consideration, converted it into the aforesaid Hospital of the Star of Bethlehem. In 1675 it was moved from Bishopsgate to Moorfields, whence, after various changes, it found its way in 1812 to the junction of the Lambeth and Kennington roads, where it remained till its final removal into the country. It was not until the end of the 18th century that it achieved notoriety through its now world-famous ghost. In 1780, a young and handsome Indian came to London, and took lodgings in the house of a merchant on Fish Street Hill, close to London Bridge. Now the merchant at that time happened to have in his employ a very plain and shy maidservant, called Rebecca, who loved poetry, especially romantic poetry, and often, when in bed, used to lie awake thinking of what she had read, and repeating aloud to herself certain lines she had memorized. Hence, it may be deduced that she was both imaginative and impressionable, the sort of girl who might easily fall in love, and fall deeply. This she did, the moment she saw the young Indian lodger, and henceforth, instead of repeating lines of poetry in bed at night, she would lie awake repeating his name and conjuring up his image. Then, one day, to her unspeakable consternation, she learned he was leaving. So reserved was Rebecca and so successful in her habitual self-restraint, that the Indian had not the slightest suspicion she was in love with him. Indeed, he scarcely thought of her at all. She inspired no sentiment whatever in him. She was just the domestic, very unattractive, and nothing more. This she did not know. Indeed, she believed rather the reverse, for she had magnified his casual, non-significant, and ordinary glances into those of ill-concealed, latent love, and tender admiration. To her bitter disappointment, not a word of regret did he utter when she brought him his breakfast that last, much-dreaded morning. He just ate it hurriedly and in silence. She followed him to the door, with some of his luggage, still hoping. And then the thunderbolt. With a careless nod of his head and a still more careless goodbye, he thrust something into her cold and not unshapely palm. It was a sovereign. The other inmates of the house and the neighbors wondered infinitely, when they saw Rebecca running after the chaise, which bore away her adored one, screaming and holding out the sovereign, which, in his innocent generosity, he had given her as a tip. The money in lieu of the love she had been so eagerly hoping for turned her brain, and she was, henceforth, a hopeless lunatic. She then became an inmate of Bedlam, that is to say, the Hospital of the Star of Bethlehem, where she remained till she died, the fatal sovereign continually in her grasp. When she died, she was still clutching it, and the sight of it in her dead fingers so aroused the cupidity of a keeper, that, biding his opportunity, he stole it. So she was buried without it? Hence the haunting. Shortly after her death strange noises were heard in the asylum at night, footsteps, and the opening and shutting of doors, some of which were locked on the inside. And more. Sometimes in the daytime, and sometimes at night, the ghost of Rebecca was seen, a lean figure, with ghastly white cheeks and wild eyes, gliding about corridors, rooms, and staircases, always hunting, with never abating feverishness, for her precious, purloined sovereign. When the asylum shifted its quarters to its last London home, Rebecca's ghost went with it and stayed there, periodically manifesting itself, according to report, to patients and officials alike, right up to the time of its removal into the country in September, 1924. Whether the haunting is still going on, I am unable to say with any degree of authority. I can only surmise that it does, from certain rumors that have reached me.